Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Doesn't look like we have too many people here right now. Hi, Carmen. Very nice to see you. Please do share. Maybe some people will come over. So I am going to remove the promo, and I'm going to get started because there are a lot of important things going on. So tonight is not a Red Beret series night. It's a news night. And what we're going to focus on, hi, Jeff Denton. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. What I'm going to concentrate on tonight is the news about the reconciliation bill. The first thing I'll start with is a piece by Robert Reich, who I almost never feature, as I think you know. But on this occasion, I decided it would be a good idea to share this piece because it was nice and simple and explicit. He usually is very explicit. And it was factual. It was done on September 14th. I picked it up at Readers Supported News. And you should be seeing it now. Are you seeing it now? Yes, you are seeing it now. Looks like a Twitter screen, doesn't it? Right now, Democrats are working to pass a $3.5 trillion package that will provide long overdue help for working Americans. Oh, Bonnie is wearing her red beret tonight. The final bill hasn't yet been determined, so we don't know the exact dollar amounts for all its policies. We'll probably find that out in late September or early October. Hope it isn't in early October because Pelosi gave her word to Josh Gottheimer that she would pass on the infrastructure bill by signing it on September, not by signing it, but by passing it through the House on September 27th. I don't know if she could giving it a floor vote on September 27th. I don't think she could say it was going to pass through the House because she doesn't know whether the progressives are going to vote against it on September 27th if the reconciliation bill, the $3.5 trillion package, has not passed. But going on. For now, the Democrats' budget resolution frames what's in the bill. And there's a little video from Reich there, but I'm not going to go through that because he's got it in writing here, so I'd rather go through it that way. First, on families, the bill would make permanent key benefits for working families. including the expanded child tax credit in the pandemic relief plan that sends families up to $300 per child each month, but is now set to expire in December and is estimated to cut child poverty by half. Well, I expressed skepticism about that, but after all, $300 per child is a good deal. It's $3,600 a year if a family has 2 young children. That would be $7,200 a year. For a working family, that is a lot of money. It would also establish the universal child care, for which low and middle income households would pay more than 7% of their incomes. That's another benefit, for working families. You put the two of these together, and it's worth a considerable amount of money to them, makes their life easier, a lot easier. Also, it provides a national program of paid leave worth up to $4,000 per month for workers who have time off because they are ill or caring for a relative. Next, on education. The bill would reduce educational inequality by establishing the universal pre-K for all 3 and 4 years old, all 3 and 4-year-olds, benefiting an estimated 5 million children, and providing tuition-free community college, essentially expanding free public education from 12 years to 16 years. Oh, I see. Including the pre-K and the 2 years of community college. It expands things from 12 years to 16 years. It will also invest in historically Black colleges, and universities, and increase the maximum amount of Pell Grants for students from lower income families. On health care, the bill expands Medicare to include dental, vision, and hearing benefits and lowers the eligibility age. It also expands Medicaid to cover people living in the 12 states that have not yet expanded Medicaid, and makes critical investments to improve health care for people of color. And the big question is, how far will it go to reduce prescription drug prices by, for example, allowing Medicare to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies? That could reduce Medicare and Medicaid spending and free up more money for other parts of the bill. But Big Pharma is dead set against this. Big corporations and the rich picking up the tab. In another step toward fairness, all of these to be financed by higher taxes on the rich and big corporations. A lot of Democrats don't want that. They should leave the party. The bill would also increase the Internal Revenue Service's funding so the agency can properly audit wealthy tax cheats who fail to report about 1/5 of their income every year, thereby costing the government $105 billion annually. In addition, the bill tackles the climate crisis, which also especially burdens the lower income Americans. There are a range of solutions, subsidizing the use of solar, wind, nuclear, and other forms of clean energy, while financially penalizing the use of dirty energy like coal, helping families pay for electric cars and energy-efficient homes. The bill might include something known as a carbon border adjustment tax, a tax on imports whose production was carbon intensive, like many from China. The bill would also establish a civilian climate corps and invest in communities that bear the brunt of the climate crisis. And the bill helps American workers. It will hopefully contain much of the PRO Act, the toughest labor law reform in a generation. Finally, the bill includes a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. This is all about making America fairer. Remember, we won't know the exact details of the bill for at least a month, but these are the main areas that it will focus on. The big challenge will be ensuring Senate Democrats remain united to get it passed. All of us will need to fight like hell. Don't listen to spending hawks who claim it's too expensive or too radical. For far too long, our government has ignored the needs of everyday Americans, catering instead to the demands of corporations and the super rich. No more, says Reich. It's time to get this landmark bill passed and build a fairer America. So that's the first piece. Now we're going to kind of throw a little cold water on it, on some of it, with, hey, Amber, how you doing? Washington State has emergency leave of absence plan. It's mostly for medical, though, but if you need to be off work, they'll pay you up to 12 weeks, I think it is. That's a terrific program from the state of Washington. So the next piece that's going to throw a little bit of cold water on it is from one of my favorite people, Stephanie Kelton. And it's her latest piece from her Substack that we're going through. I left the link in there. She says, it's too late for MMT-inspired budgeting. I don't know why she included this particular drawing. I don't know if it's somebody walking or somebody standing in an elevator. I don't know what the person is doing. But anyway, in my recent 3-part series on the congressional, quote, pay for, unquote, game, I lamented the congressional budget process, which is antithetical to MMT. I explained that it's mostly political theater, which is masquerading as sound finance. In the realm of the theatric, we've seen some peacocking from various Democrats, including Representative Stephanie Murphy of Florida, who is voicing concerns about the pace at which things are moving. The overall price tag, the pace at which things are moving. When did they pass the first reconciliation bill, the last reconciliation bill? March 15th. As far as I can tell, they've been screwing around since March 15th. It's now September 15th. That's 6 months, as far as I can tell. She's voicing concerns about the pace at which things are moving, the overall price tag, and the yet to be hammered out, quote, pay fors, unquote, in the proposed $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan. Somebody primary her. My constituents expect me to consider bills in a thorough and transparent way. Well, that would be great if you knew enough to know that a fiscally responsible federal government budgets for public purpose, not to cut the size of a spending bill just for the sake of cutting it. She tweets, "While I support many provisions in the Build Back Better Act, it's being rushed through my committee before we know exactly what's in it and what it's going to cost and how we're going to pay for it. Why is this woman a committee chair? What is she doing chairing a committee? Doesn't look like she's smart enough for dog catcher." On the Senate side, all eyes remain focused on Senator Manchin, Democrat, West Virginia, who recently called for a, quote, strategic pause, unquote, on the entire effort. In other words, 6 months of wasted time wasn't enough for him. Manchin's theatrics were punctuated by comments from that wonderful progressive, the House Majority Whip, James Clyburn. "I think what has happened here is that communication around this Build Back Better plan, which has a ceiling of $3.5 trillion, is just that, a ceiling. No one has ever said that's an exact number or that's a floor. It's up to $3.5 trillion. Now I see that Joe Manchin has mentioned a $1.5 trillion number. So somewhere between $1.5 trillion and $3.5, there is $2 trillion. Those $2 trillion are there, and I think there's a lot of room for people to sit down and negotiate." Bernie already negotiated. $3.5 trillion was the floor he was willing to accept. He asked for $6 trillion. Bernie, that's why you shouldn't be doing business with these idiots. You asked for $6 trillion. You should have put $6 trillion in the frickin' bill because they were going to ask for a negotiation anyway. So you might as well have negotiated from $6 trillion instead of $3.5 trillion. Bernie, don't you know how to sell a house or buy one? That's what lawmakers are doing now. At the heart of those particular negotiations lie two basic questions, says Stephanie. How much can Democrats agree to spend? And how much of that spending should they aim to offset in order to avoid adding to the deficit? The answer to the last question is partially baked into the budget resolution framework. That framework gives specific guidance to 13 House and 12 Senate committees to begin drawing up legislation for a $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. The quick and dirty version is summarized in this memorandum to Democratic senators, while the memo asserts that the entire package will be, quote, fully offset by a combination of new tax revenues, healthcare savings, and long-term economic growth, unquote. The resolution itself only requires the Finance Committee to fully offset its spending. The head of the, I'm not sure who the head of the Finance Committee is in the House. In the Senate, the Finance Committee is Ron Wyden, of Oregon, who was making some foolish noises a while ago that seemed to have subsided somewhat. The Fiscal 2022 resolution will provide the Finance Committee with instruction that allows for $1.8 trillion in investments for working families, the elderly, and the environment, historic tax cut for Americans making less than $400,000 a year, ensuring that the wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share of taxes, and hundreds of billions, good luck with that last one, by the way, and hundreds of billions in additional savings by lowering the price of prescription drugs. In order to give the Senate Finance Committee the flexibility it needs to accomplish these goals, the text of the budget resolution will provide the Finance Committee with an instruction to reduce the deficit by a nominal amount of $1 billion over 10 years.
And we got 10 years?
Barney asks, have we got 10 years? A good question. None of the other 11 Senate committees are required to offset anything. What this means is that the budget resolution framework gives lawmakers the option to let half of the entire package, 1.75 trillion, dribble onto the deficit over time. Maybe it will take long enough to dribble that by that time, everybody in Washington will believe in the MMT approach to economics. Then they won't be worried about the freaking deficit, except but for worrying about the consequences of the bill and the desirability of avoiding inflation. Is that too much to hope for? Probably. But if they let it dribble for long enough, maybe by that time people will just forget about the deficit. If you have the appetite for the legislative minutia, Wendy Edelberg breaks it down nicely around the 10-minute mark here. Stephanie gives a little link to something by Wendy Edelberg, who's a fiscal responsibility. Some people would say maven, I would say hawk. From an MMT perspective, there's no inherent problem with that. Indeed, it isn't clear that any of the 3.5 trillion requires offsets. But that ship has sailed. While the thought of adding to the deficit doesn't spook everyone in Congress, it remains a potential sticking point for people like Joe Manchin, who reportedly gets daily updates about the national debt from one of his Senate aides. All his Senate aide has to do is to go to the daily Treasury statement. I previously argued the only way to win the pay-for game is not to play, says Stephanie. But here we are. It's too late for a rain delay. The game is underway, and we're in the bottom of the first inning. Stephanie loves these baseball analogies. At this point, the goal for Democrats is to find a way to get the $550 billion bipartisan infrastructure package, which has already passed the Senate, and the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill to Biden's desk as quickly as possible. The vast majority of Democrats feel a sense of urgency to deliver. When asked about Manchin's call for a strategic pause, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer told reporters, quote, "We're moving full speed ahead," unquote. When speed is your goal, says Stephanie, friction is not your friend. Here's how Schumer describes the frictions he's facing. Quote, "There are some in my caucus who believe 3.5 trillion is too much. There are some in my caucus who believe it's too little," he said. Quote again, "And we're going to work very hard to have unity, because without unity, we're not going to get anything," unquote. Unity is vital. Without it, Democrats can push through a spending package of any size. They need all 50 Democrats to use reconciliation in the Senate. They can't afford to lose more than 3 Democrats in the House. They're walking a tightrope, and President Biden's domestic policy agenda hangs in the balance. As we speak, the legislative markup process is underway, and committees in both chambers of Congress are moving forward using the $3.5 trillion outlined in the budget resolution. Many Democrats, like Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, are in no mood to negotiate that number down. As she put it, quote, "There is no flexibility on the price tag." And it's not because I care about what the top line is. It's because I care about delivering on these benefits. If we don't deliver, then I think all the people who came out and voted for Democrats to take control of the House, the Senate, and the White House are going to come out and say, quote, "That's it," unquote. You might be thinking, quote, "Yeah, but Manchin already said he won't support anything close to 3.5 trillion, so it can't happen," unquote. Think again. Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, has described Manchin as, quote, "very persuadable." Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat of Minnesota, agrees. She notes that it may take some time and effort to persuade Manchin to vote for the package, but that he eventually, quote, "gets to the right place," unquote. It was, after all, only 8 months ago that Senator Manchin was calling for up to $4 trillion in infrastructure spending, unquote. Here's what he said in January 2021. "The most important thing, do infrastructure, spend 2, 3, 4 trillion over a 10-year period on infrastructure." For once, I agreed with Joe Manchin about that. It will take more than 4 trillion to fix that infrastructure. Let's assume the size of the reconciliation package remains close to 3.5 trillion. Democrats will haggle over the scope of some of its provisions, but the big frictions will occur, as they always do, on the, quote, "pay for," unquote, side. Biden has been clear from the beginning. To offset the 3.5 trillion, Congress will target wealthy Americans and large corporations. Quote, "No one making under $400,000 will see their taxes go up, period," unquote, Biden has pledged. And there's a YouTube about it linked to from here. Taxing the rich to, quote, "pay for" the Build Back Better agenda is wildly popular among voters. And Stephanie displays the results of a Politico Morning Consult poll. 65% of voters support higher taxes on corporations to pay for Biden's infrastructure plan. And there it is. $2 trillion infrastructure plan through 15 years of higher taxes on corporations. 38% of all voters strongly support it. 27% of all voters somewhat support it. That's 65% right there. 13% don't know, have no opinion. Only 21% oppose, either somewhat oppose or strongly oppose. Among Democrats, it's 85% who support it. Among independents, 60% support it. Among Republicans, 42% support it. The friction is inside the Beltway, where lobbyists and other special interest groups are doing everything they can to persuade lawmakers to limit the, quote, "hardship," unquote, on corporations and higher income earners. I'm talking about people like Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the Chamber of Commerce, who hopes to see the $3.5 trillion package collapse, quote, under its own weight, unquote, in his view. Quote, "The proposed tax increases are unprecedented, but also inadequate to pay for all the programs while complying with Senate rules on budgeting." Screw the Senate rules on budgeting, say I. And while he might be right about the unprecedented, say I mean me, I don't mean Stephanie. She didn't say that. And while he might be right about the unprecedented nature of the Biden administration's proposed tax increases, he is surely wrong about it being impossible to deliver an adequate list of so-called pay-fors, quote unquote, that comply with Senate rules. Remember, the $3.5 trillion budget resolution framework instructs lawmakers to come up with $1.75 trillion in offsets, leaving open the option to allow the remaining $1.75 trillion to dribble onto the deficit over 10 years. Senate rules allow the deficit to increase inside the 10-year budget window. It should be pretty easy for Democrats to comply with all of that. As we saw with the bipartisan infrastructure deal, offsetting some of the spending is probably easier than offsetting all of it. While the bipartisan group, and by the way, much better for the economy, just to offset 1.75 trillion of it, because that means there's going to be at least 1.75 trillion of deficit spending each year over the next 10 years, helping to fulfill the very large deficit spending requirement we will have to keep the economy going, as I've pointed out in other live streams. As we saw with the bipartisan infrastructure deal, offsetting some of the spending is probably easier than offsetting all of it. While the bipartisan group, which included Joe Manchin, by the way, started off hoping to arrive at a hard infrastructure paid for, they ended up agreeing to offset only about half of the proposed spending. The reason? While unprecedented tax hikes on corporations and wealthy Americans are incredibly popular with voters, there isn't a huge appetite, even among Democrats in Congress, to raise a slew of taxes. At the end of the day, Manchin and others found it more palatable to offset part of the spending and let the rest fall upon the deficit. That's very good. $550 billion in new spending. Half of it is about $550. Half of it is about $275 billion over 10 years. So that's another $27.5 billion worth of deficit, in addition to the $200 billion a year I just cited. Oh, is it 1.7 trillion? I forget. You'll remind me later. Don't rule out something like that happening again. In fact, that's exactly what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi recently channeled. We will pay for more than half, maybe all of the legislation. That's not a very heavy lift. And if Manchin and others insist on going all the way, then just do these three things. Enforce existing tax law. This has to be the lowest hanging pay-for fruit on the tree. Lawmakers could have used it to offset the cost of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed the Senate last month, but Republicans wouldn't go for it. So this big, juicy pay-for is now available for use in reconciliation, and it doesn't even require a tax increase. All you have to do is to enforce the laws that are already on the books. Yeah, Natasha Sarin, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, just released this handy explainer. It's all about the tax gap, quote unquote, the difference between taxes that are owed and collected. She estimates that the gap is around $600 billion annually. The IRS commissioner puts it closer to $1 trillion per year. Sarin says it amounts to approximately $7 trillion of lost tax revenue over the next decade. She also points out the tax gap is a, quote, major source of inequality, unquote, which means it's worth addressing from an MMT perspective, independent of the, quote, pay-for game. You see, MMT is for taxing in order to introduce inequality. And of course, that's what closing the tax gap is about. It doesn't raise the tax rates. It just enforces the law and gets that extra money of the rich out of the system, thus protecting, to some small degree anyway, our teetering democracy. To narrow the tax gap, the Biden administration wants to provide the IRS with an additional $80 billion to improve taxpayer services and to help the agency go after high-income tax cheats. Sarin estimates that this would raise $780 billion over 10 years and an additional $1.6 trillion over the subsequent decade. If Democrats could count all $2.4 trillion in additional revenue against a $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, they'd be about 70% of the way there. Number 2, raise the corporate income tax rate to 25% and impose a 15% global minimum tax on book income for corporations with at least $100 million in annual income. Republicans lowered this rate from 35 to 21% as part of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA. That was Trump's tax cut, you recall. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and a relatively small group of other Democrats wanted to restore the rate to 35%. That never stood a chance. Biden's plan called for an increase to 28%, which would have raised $1.3 trillion over 10 years, but that also met with too much friction. What appears to have broad support is a 4 percentage point increase in the corporate tax rate. Raise the rate to 25%, Democrats can count another $600 to $700 billion in offsets. And if Democrats want to stop profitable corporations such as Nike and FedEx from paying nothing, zero, in federal income tax, then they can support Secretary Yellen's push for a global minimum tax. That could generate another $200 to $300 billion in offsets. Then there's step 3, let Medicare negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. The same legislation that expanded Medicare to include prescription drug coverage in 2003 also prohibited the federal government from lowering drug costs by negotiating prices with drug makers. Apart from those who work in the pharmaceutical industry, those who lobby on their behalf, and those who benefit from their campaign contributions, almost no one thinks this makes any sense. Indeed, the Kaiser Family Foundation recently found that almost 90% of those polled would like to see Medicare negotiate prices. It's wildly popular and it generates hundreds of billions in offsets. So there we are, the 3 steps, and then here's a poll on large majorities across party, age, favor the following: the federal government to negotiate drug prices. The total is 88% favor. Party ID, 96% of Democrats, 89% of independents, and even 70% of Republicans. By age, 18 to 64-year-olds, 87%. 65 years old and older, 89%. CBO has estimated the cost savings over 10 years at between $450 billion and $530 billion, depending on how many drug prices, 25 versus 50, Medicare is allowed to negotiate. So where does that leave us? Taking the Treasury Department's conservative estimate on enforcement, together with CBO's most recent estimate on drug price negotiations and an average revenue estimate for corporate tax increases, we end up with just over $2.2 trillion. That's enough to offset well over half of the proposed $3.5 trillion. There's a little graphic, $2.21 trillion, $530 billion from the negotiation, $780 billion from enforcement, $900 billion in taxes, in new taxes. But will it be enough for conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin, who just yesterday raised concerns about paying for only half of the $3.5 trillion? That's where the rest of the enforcement money comes in. I don't see Joe Manchin embracing MMT in time to get him over his obsession with debt and deficits, but perhaps he could persuade himself to look beyond the conventional 10-year budget window and factor that 1.6 trillion in future enforcement revenue into his calculations. I work for the Senate Budget Committee, so I know nothing is as easy as 1, 2, 3 when it comes to any of this stuff. But I also know that the clock is ticking, and I know that friction is the enemy of progress. So I offer this three-step plan in the spirit of making progress. So now, you had Reich telling you what's in the bill and why it's good for people and the various things that are good for people. And now you have Stephanie telling us how it might be paid for because we have to play the game of paying for, quote, unquote. But we have to note it's not being paid for very much. That actually quite a bit of it is not going to be paid for by taxes or by raising taxes. It'll be paid for by tax informants and then 900 billion in taxes out of the 3.5 trillion. So Stephanie knows how to play the game. She tells us how to play this game. She tells us how to play this game in a way that's going to be popular. And she gives us a hint that maybe this bill really can be passed. Now let's go to some other views. Oh, there's Lisa. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Carmen. Nice to see you too. Guess I saw you before, Carmen. Hi, Sandy. Thank you for sharing, folks. Amber remarks on that nice leave thing they have in Washington. And Lana says, hello, is watching Jen Perelman, who has Tom Hartman in to talk Medicare for All. Tom Hartman and I should have a talk, okay, on Medicare for All. Anyway, going on. Next piece I want to comment on and read through is by William Rivers Pitt. And it appeared in Truth Out not so very long ago. On September 13th. Title of it is Conservative Democrats Threaten Devastating Cuts to the Budget Bill. There's Joe Manchin looking for all the world like a mafia don. And William Rivers Pitt starts off. Last week it seemed as if many Democrats were gearing up for a robust fight to pass every part of their $3.5 trillion climate-directed budget. Quote, that $3.5 trillion is already the result of a major compromise, said Bernie. 3.5T is the floor, says Rashida. We're moving full speed ahead, said Chuck Schumer. In the face of threats from perennial legislation troll Joe Manchin. A legislation troll yet, huh? Days later, and while solid progressives like Sanders and Tlaib are holding firm, others are wavering. Democrats are fighting with Democrats over how much of the bill to cut again. The issue is not the portions addressing climate change, on the surface at least. It's actually much filthier. Conservative Democrats are kicking and screaming over how much the bill intends to tax rich people and corporations in order to pay for itself, and party leadership appears ready to give in to those concerns. There I was foolish enough to hope. So Stephanie has shown us how party leadership could give in to those concerns and still, quote, pay for the bill to the extent it is required that it pay for it. So Pitt says, there I was, foolish enough to hope. A draft plan which emerged on Sunday from the House Ways and Means Committee is a departure from the original proposal in a variety of ways. If the math adds up, the combined proposals would raise $2.9 trillion in new revenues. The top capital gains rate would jump from 20% to 25%, and alterations to what is defined as investment income would bump that number to 28.3%. This is, of course, less than what was first preferred by billions. Also included in the Ways and Means proposal, according to an Axios review of a Washington Post report, quote, accelerating the end of the $24 million estate tax exemption would bring in another $50 billion, imposing an additional 3% tax on Americans who make more than $5 million would raise $127 billion. Expanded restrictions on carried interest impacting how private equity firms compensate employees could bring another $14 billion. The pharmaceutical industry could be forced to foot $700 billion of new spending by negotiating rates directly with Medicare. Add these provisions and others up, and you get to $2.9 trillion. Getting from $2.9 trillion to $3.5 trillion involves the kinds of fingers crossed, argle-bargle, he says. The English term for it is argy-bargy. I think I like that better than argle-bargle. But anyway, argle-bargle, that has kept trickle-down economics alive for so long. In marking up the bill, Democrats intend to employ something called, quote, dynamic scoring, unquote. I remember when Paul Ryan wanted to use dynamic scoring for things, and the Democrats were entirely against it, making fun of the dynamic scoring. But here they are, intending to employ dynamic scoring, a mathematics game that assumes all the other stuff will stimulate the economy enough to produce that missing $600 billion. And the dynamic part? Laying a more than $500 billion bet on, quote, trust us, unquote. Well, it probably is going to stimulate the economy enough to produce that missing $600 trillion. I mean, for God's sakes, that is only a multiplier. What's that a multiplier of? 600 billion on top of the 2.9 trillion? That's nothing. I mean, the 2.9 trillion ought to be good for a multiplier up to at least 5.8 trillion, maybe more. Certainly, we could get enough taxes out of that to produce another 600 billion, don't you think? Anyway, the dynamic part, laying more than $500 billion bet on, quote, trust us, unquote. But the good part of this is, if we don't get the 600 billion, if you don't actually tax away the 600 billion, so what? It doesn't really matter. At least not for spending this 3.5 trillion, it doesn't matter. It matters because we won't have gotten 600 billion bucks out of the rich or have to go back later and get it. Not for the revenue, just for the danger it represents to democracy. All this, I suspect, amounts to little more than chum for the swarming corporate and energy lobbyists who are already gnawing away at the draft proposal like hungry sharks. Can't you just see the image? Quote, the far-reaching social policy bill under construction in Congress has much that corporate America has long sought from Washington, reports the New York Times. But the bill also contains plenty for America to dislike, particularly the tax increases that would pay for it. Why would corporate America, yes, would dislike the tax increases? And in the cold calculus of corporate lobbying, industries are working hard to bring the whole enterprise down, unquote. Everything from the capital gains bump to the corporate tax increases under assault because these combined proposals chisel away at the $1 trillion Trump tax cut of 2017, and a grim number of corporate beholden Democrats are giving ear to those complaints. One, of course, unnamed lobbyist told the Hill back in September, quote, the business community has made progress with certain Democrats on legitimate policy concerns with some of these proposals and their implications on the economy and international competitiveness. Okay? A lot of those arguments are landing. Yeah. I'm skeptical about that. Quote, the economy, unquote, and quote, international competitiveness, unquote. Right. They must send these people to Capitol Hill reporters with buzzword flashcards. Beyond them are the Joe Manchins of the world, whose entire political existence is stapled to fossil fuel money. If they can deeply damage a climate bill in the name of fiscal responsibility, they will be grateful for the political cover and the complicit corporate, quote, news, unquote, media will be more than happy to skip the nuance in their coverage. Congressional progressives and their activist allies are making it clear that watering this bill down amounts to an utterly unacceptable capitulation to big money. There is a sense of urgency, which I think the American people understand, said Bernie on Sunday. Quote, and what they want is finally, maybe, just maybe, the Congress of the United States will act for them and not just for the wealthy campaign contributors, unquote. Erica Payne, founder and president of the progressive advocacy group, Patriotic Millionaires, took it further. Quote, America's billionaires are popping champagne tonight as the House Ways and Means Committee, led by Chair Richie Neal, fails the president, fails the country, and fails history. If this proposal becomes law, working people in America will continue to pay almost twice the tax rate of millionaire investors. Heirs to billionaires will continue to inherit enormous amounts of money and property tax-free, and the concentration of wealth and power will continue in this country becomes what it is already fast approaching, a feudal aristocracy, unquote. The patriotic millionaires said of the House plan. And because the House Ways and Means Committee refuses to stand up to the 55 profitable multinational companies that paid no federal income tax last year, corporations will continue to play international shell games with their profits while moving American jobs overseas. Beyond the bottomless greed of the one percenters and their business allies lurks the belief held dear by too many members of Congress that being perceived as doing something is vastly preferable to actually doing something. Quote, these people, unquote, I wrote on August 10th after a drastically denuded infrastructure bill passed in the Senate, quote, are happy to have something in hand to prove they actually work for a living. After all, it's Washington, D.C., details of the bill matter far less than the fact of the bill's passage, unquote. After some hopeful noise last week, the retreat seems to be on. At moments like this, I close my eyes and play out a scenario where Democratic leadership, with broadly popular legislation in hand, finally decides to stop haggling with over Democrats over how much to strip out and shave down. Quote, most Americans love this bill, unquote, my imaginary Pelosi and Schumer tell the right-wing leaning elements of their caucus. Quote again, and you're going to vote for it. It will improve people's lives noticeably, including the lives of your constituents. We'll all run on that next year, and we will win. Vote against it at your peril, unquote. Even if this strategy fails and the legislation is defeated, there is merit to the approach. Shake most any citizen awake in the middle of the night and ask them what pisses them off most about Democrats, and a large swath will reply, quote, they're weak. They're always retreat. They never seem to stand for anything. At least Republicans stand for something, unquote. That, the quote, something, unquote, is comprehensively horrifying, did not stop 74 million people from pulling a lever for Donald Trump 10 short months ago. It is, alas, what it is for the time being anyway. There you have it. Democrats perfecting the art of losing debates with Democrats since 1981. Let the undoing commence again. So, William Rivers Pitt is skeptical about the ability of this Democratic Party to actually deliver. Elvira Mahalko says Paul Ryan is disgusting. He was quite disgusting. And Lon says, agreed, you should talk to Tom. Thank you, Lon. And now, two important pieces by some people who keep up with what's going on in the soft underbelly of the Congress. Here's a post on Infrastructure Summer by Dave Dayen, done yesterday from the Prospect. Infrastructure Summer, the Sophie's choice of the reconciliation bill. Not such good news, this, right? The Build Back Better Act promises to finally remedy the disastrous way we take care of the elderly in America. I appreciate that, since I, of course, am elderly. The pandemic revealed the perils of warehousing seniors in understaffed and even dangerous nursing homes. Large majorities prefer to age in place or receive assistance with a disability at home, but the supportive care needed for this is outrageously expensive and scarce. The poorer people must literally drain all their resources to get Medicaid to pay for home care, and even then they can languish on a wait list for years. Moreover, while home care is one of the fastest growing professions in the economy, it is also one of the lowest paid, averaging about $12 per hour. Can't live in Ashburn, Virginia for $12 an hour. Fixing home and community-based services, HCBS, home and community-based services, that is, involves two essential stages: increasing affordable access to services and raising the living standards of the direct care workforce. Making care work more remunerative doesn't matter if not enough people can afford it. And increasing access won't happen if the work is so low paying that people must constantly leave the profession. Fixing both requires a lot of money. In the American Jobs Plan, the Biden administration put support for HCBS at $400 billion. But this promise ran up against artificial scarcity as reluctant conservative Democrats resisted the overall spending and tax measures. First, the rumor was that only $150 billion would be made available for HCBS. In the House Energy and Conference Committee markup of the bill, That expanded to $190 billion after a concentrated push from activists. But those activists maintain that the new figure is insufficient. There's been a memo circulated around Congress and the White House explaining that you simply cannot meet HCBS goals on access or worker pay without at least $250 billion based on projections from the Congressional Budget Office. Anything below that, and states will opt out of the provisions intended to make care work remunerative and accessible. Quote, if you don't have enough money, the first thing that will fall off is direct care wages, unquote. Said Nicole Jorwick, Senior Director of Public Policy at the ARC, an advocacy group for people with disabilities. This would create a vicious cycle, Jorwick explained. The states that aren't making the effort to improve care infrastructure on their own won't get enough to fix it. And the states that are making the effort may not see a lowball amount of federal support as worth adding a state match to obtain. Okay, the disability community has other goals that are in the legislation, including changing the rules to bolster supplemental security income and ensuring better access to affordable prescription drugs. Given how an inadequate amount of money would fail to improve HCBS, I put the question to Jorwick that nobody really wants to answer. Would you rather get half of everything you want or a workable policy on one of your priorities? She hesitated. We're not going to ever say no thanks to money for HCBS, she explained. Quote, but after a pandemic where 1/3 of the deaths were in nursing home facilities, you can't do a half-funded proposal. It's not like other policies where you could truncate it, unquote. This Hobson's choice, figuring out whether to live with less on every policy in the Build Back Better Act or to jettison some and make sure the policies remaining actually work and are politically potent, is agonizing for activists and members of Congress. In a better world, this choice wouldn't exist. The policies reflect critical human needs, and deciding to punt on them yet again should be unacceptable. But the axis of Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema has decided they must have a cap on both spending and revenues, which is forcing these difficult conversations. Adding to the frustration is the sheer number of policies in the legislation when you put all your priorities as a party into one bill. Which, of course, why do they have to do that? Why do they have to put all their priorities into one bill? Because they have the filibuster. It's the filibuster. They need to put everything in the reconciliation bill. Anyway, you draw in every member who's been fighting for one part or another for years. But when the overall top lines get cut, nobody wants to take out their pet project. The only other option is to cut everything across the board, which can lead to a slew of ineffective half measures. We're seeing this play out in several ways. Some programs like HCBS are just being cut. Others, like the dental benefit in Medicare, are being delayed for several years. This makes it look cheaper within the 10-year budget window. But that exacts a political cost. These people need to read Stephanie's Substack, don't they? But that exacts a political cost. Quote, our investments need to be, number one, transformative, and number two, felt immediately, said Representative Jayapal, chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Quote, people need to see that giving us the House, Senate, and White House matters. Literally feel it in their bones that their lives and livelihoods are transformed, unquote. Quite right. She knows the mistakes that Democrats made when they were in full control of the House, the Senate, and the executive branch in 2009 and 2010. There was no transformative stuff. There was a Recovery Act that was too weak, and a Healthcare Reform Act that didn't kick in for 4 years, while the taxes for it started immediately. They looked like idiots. They had nothing to run on in 2010, which is why they got killed all over the country, and we're still feeling the effects of that today. Jayapal noted the victory in the House Education and Labor Committee for a coalition of the progressive and frontline Democratic the Democrats. Who are the frontline Democrats? They're the ones whose seats are in jeopardy in 2022. So there was a coalition between the progressives and the frontliners, securing a universal child care program, capping child care costs for all Americans at 7% of income, over leadership objections. But she acknowledged that the subsidies that would carry out that universal program phase in over 6 years. We're trying to get as many subsidies out in the first year as possible, Jayapal said. But ultimately, it'll be a slow ramp up, and many will wonder what the child care benefit did for them. Oh, that's terrible. Terrible. Democrats has also worked the other end, forwarding policies that sunset in a few years rather than making them permanent. The House version of the expanded child tax credit, for example, sunsets in 2025. Senate Democrats may opt for a year earlier, 2024. Don't do it. Don't do it. One of the things they can run on in 2024 is that people will lose the child tax credit if they don't want to reelect Democrats in 2024. But if it sunsets a year earlier, it will be gone by 2024, by election time 2024. And then people will be angry at them for letting it expire before the election. Manchin wants to add work requirements to the child tax credit, which would limit it for the poorest families, a self-destructive notion. Why doesn't somebody kick this guy in the pants? Separately, the paid leave proposal in the House acts as a stopgap on top of existing state and employer-based programs. This also makes it cheaper, but creates a logistical nightmare for individuals and businesses. And so Democrats can either settle for these chinks in their programs, making them in some cases not work for a lot of people, or they can decide to do a few things well. It's a tough choice to make. Maybe a tough choice to make, but I'm telling you, it's always best to do a few things well so you can claim credit for something that works, rather than having everything spread and having to argue that this is going to be good in the future. We're sorry it's not working now, but we couldn't get through something that would work now. That's so stupid. Just can't believe it. Quote, "We don't want half measures. We want stuff that's effective and works," unquote, said Andy Levin, Democrat of Michigan, on a press call on Monday. The Congress that's elected in 2026 will decide what happens in 2027 and 2028. The way we affect them is by creating programs that working families say are right. And Representative Mondale Jones agreed with Levin on the call. It's better that we do programs well than do half measures that turn out not to materially improve the lives of most people and do not engender the broad support of programs like Social Security and Medicare. Even moderates like Representative Susan Del Bene of Washington, who chairs the New Democrat coalition, have stressed the importance of doing, quote, a few things really well, singling out the child tax credit. But this theory slams headlong into the realities of pitting programs against one another and nobody wanting their top priority to be put on the wait list. One of the reasons it's become so hard is that the needs are so acute. All of these pieces are decades-long problems that the federal government hasn't taken a look at, Jorwick said. There's a possible safety valve As the Prospect's Bob Cutner reported this week, a potential deal is emerging that would allow Manchin to scale down direct spending in the reconciliation bill while including up to $1.5 trillion in middle-class tax cuts. Please, no. Some of these, like the CTC and other low-earner taxes, were already in there, but you could fashion child care subsidies as a tax cut, or do it for Section 8 housing vouchers, or create a tax cut for union membership. In short, do the spending through the tax code. That would potentially allow something like $3.5 trillion in total outlays to meet Joe Manchin's approval. But even if you did that, not everything can be translated into a tax cut, and there will still be some hard choices. The question is whether Democrats and their allies are willing to make them, or whether half measures, which nobody seems to want, will rule the day. I bet that's the first time you heard that particular analysis. But to me, it seems a really good prognostication of what might happen to really screw things up. That's how they screwed things up in 2009, 2010. And I could well screw things up in that way again. So the last piece is another one from the Prospect. Infrastructure Summer, a surprisingly radical housing bill. This one is by Alexander Salmon. It was done on September 16, 2021. There is Marcia Fudge speaking after a tour of the Spire and Affordable Apartment Community, August 13th, 2021, in Alexandria, Virginia. And in the background, you see where my cursor is going, is Don Beyer. He is the congressman from the Virginia 8th, where Bonnie and I used to live before we came out here to Ashburn, Virginia. The Build Back Better Act, Democrats' reconciliation bill, featuring most of President Biden's priorities, is hard to sum up succinctly. It's a climate bill featuring historic and sorely needed investment in the green transition. It's a family care bill featuring paid family leave, a universal pre-K, and a home health care program. It's a health care bill with lowered prescription drug prices. Obamacare exchange subsidies, a solution for Medicaid recipients in non-expansion states, and dental care under Medicare. All of this still subject to negotiation by House Democrats and the Senate, of course, which will cause everyone watching to pull their hair out. Yes, a hair pulling out incident just occurred, but today on the Energy and Commerce Committee pulled out of the bill, okay, the provision for negotiating Medicare, the drug prices. Very, very important part of the bill, pulled out by the Energy and Commerce Committee. Why did it get pulled out? Because 3 Democrats defected. One of the 3 Democrats to defect was, what's her name? Kathleen Clark. Catherine. No, not Catherine Clark. Not Kathleen Clark. Sorry, her name is on the tip of my tongue, and I am having trouble recouping it. But this woman was one of the 28 Democrats who defected during the TPP fight. She's a conservative Democrat from Long Island. She is Kathleen Rice. She decided to defect. She is also the conservative Democrat who Nancy Pelosi put on the Energy and Commerce Committee in preference to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because the party was angry at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for supporting primary challenges. So one of the ways they punished her was to give Kathleen Rice the seat that she wanted on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Now things come around again, and Pelosi wants to have a negotiation of Medicare drug prices in that particular bill and passed as part of the $3.5 trillion bill because it can cause savings in the neighborhood of what, $700 billion or something like that. So Pelosi now wants it in that bill, and Rice repays her for the appointment by taking it out of the bill, by voting to take it out of the bill. So, don't think that it's taken out of the bill permanently. It's not. There are ways to recoup this. That is to say, it's possible to have a manager's amendment to put it right back into the bill. Then if Kathleen Rice wants to oppose it, she would have to vote against the whole $3.5 trillion package. And she doesn't want to do that. No way is she going to be willing to do that. If she did that, her career would be dead. And she knows it. So, it's going to be put back in. It's probably going to be passed. Who are the managers who can put it back in? Well, the head of the Budget Committee in the House can put it back in because he's one of the managers. He can put it back in. Who is that person? John Yarmuth, the MMTer himself. He will not hesitate to put that back into the bill. So it's going to be put back in. It's not over. But that's the way Rice paid back Nancy Pelosi for her stupidity in appointing Rice. Going on. Also in the bill, Obamacare exchange subsidies, a solution for Medicare recipients in non-expanded states, and dental care under Medicare. All of this still subject to negotiation by House Democrats and the Senate, of course, which will cause everyone to pull their hair out. I think I read that one before. One of the few things the bill has not gotten much attention for is its housing program. That's not because the housing proposals are lacking. The bill features a substantial investment in a number of housing-related priorities that run the gamut from technocratic nudges favored by neoliberals to significant resources directed towards activist-favorite solutions, including money for new public housing developments and community land trusts. Running through the housing provisions introduced for markup by the House Financial Services Committee, which wrapped up this week, shows an interesting all-of-the-above approach to one of the most vexing problems in the American economy, the soaring cost of housing. The bill features $327 billion in new spending on housing, with the bulk of that money going to public housing and housing vouchers, as well as some low-income development. All told, the best-case scenario could see the bill cutting homelessness in half within 5 years, although it features that new favored Democratic construction in that some of it expires in 2026 and will need to be made permanent by a future Congress. Starting with the small stuff, the bill features money for reforming zoning codes written to excite YIMBYs everywhere, that is YIMBYs everywhere. It allocates I don't even know what YIMBYs are. It allocates $4.5 billion in grants. It could be, if Lisa's here tonight, that she knows what YIMBYs are. Allocates $4.5 billion in grants, basically a bribe, to the municipalities that change their land use laws to encourage and streamline the building of duplexes and triplexes on single-family lots. This validates the theory that on development, on density, and supply are at least part of the solution. The dollar value pales in comparison to the money allocated for public housing. This $80 billion pot represents such a substantial investment that it could nearly though not entirely, make up the funding deficit that has plagued the country's major public housing authorities for years. That $80 billion is allocated in an interesting and unusual way, with $66 billion of it under the direct discretion of HUD Development Secretary Marcia Fudge. As Paul Williams, a fellow at the Jane Family Institute, writes, the standard formula for allocating public funding money has sharply underserved public housing authorities in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Secretary Fudge will now have the opportunity to remedy the most acute shortfalls those cities are experiencing. The structure of that system proves the importance of Secretary Fudge's appointment for progressives, while Fudge herself wanted to head up agriculture, not HUD. The appointment of a former Congressional Progressive Caucus member to a cabinet position in the Biden administration now has a chance to pay huge dividends for housing advocates nationwide who have an ally empowered with significant funding. For the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, for example, which sports a $40 billion shortfall in its funding, Secretary Fudge could nearly close the gap in one fell swoop. Elsewhere, HUD's two main rental assistance programs are getting $90 billion, with $75 billion for Section 8 housing vouchers over just 5 years, a substantial infusion of cash as well. If we break that out on an annual basis, that would make for a roughly 50% increase in its annual budget. Currently, Section 8 has only enough funding to help 1 in 5 families with their housing needs. This proposal would step up aid to extremely low-income households and those at risk of homelessness or domestic violence. Like the public housing program, it's not enough to fully fund all the expressed need, but it's a big step in the right direction. There's almost $72 billion for investments in affordable housing production through the Home Investment Program, and another nod, but to the need for more housing supply. That should boost projects for multifamily housing all over the country. And there are smaller amounts of money, too, for things like community land trusts, which is a favorite approach of activists, particularly in smaller American cities where land costs are exorbitantly higher. Community land trusts allow communities to purchase the land on which housing exists and maintain control over the housing stock, a shared equity structure that prevents outside landlords from driving up prices and allows residents to benefit from rising property values. The bill allocates money to help community groups purchase housing to be managed in this way. It would be a big boost to groups in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that are attempting to create the largest community land trust in the country. While it may not be the most effective solution for expensive cities where purchasing land is cost prohibitive, it shows an interesting willingness to entertain non-traditional solutions suggested by activists. Plus, there are other non-monetary commitments of note as well. The bill exempts the appropriated funds from counting under the Fairclough Amendment in 1998, the provision that prohibits HUD from funding new public housing development if it increases the number of units a public housing authority owns. Most of the public housing funds are intended to go towards the backlog of repairs, and so little new public housing is likely to be built. But getting rid of the Fairclough Amendment has been a priority for Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Representative Nydia Velázquez of New York. And this stipulation signals a new attitude from Congress towards building public housing, which has been impossible for decades. For the first time in a long time, public housing authorities are being told they can build and expand. The question, of course, is whether all of these provisions survive the process of deliberation. Residents of public and subsidized housing are not the most powerful constituencies in Washington, which is currently teeming with lobbyists as corporate interests try to hollow out the reconciliation bill. Despite the White House's willingness to engage with housing activists and groups like the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, it will be a battle to keep the interests of low-income residents and the precariously housed in place. If the size of the bill begins to shrink, the lack of publicity surrounding the housing commitments and the amount of money allocated to people who don't tend to vote in outsized numbers will make it an easy target for cut-happy Democrats like Joe Manchin. But Manchin's Democratic colleague, Mark Warner, has already signaled his issues with the housing package himself, not because of the low-income housing provisions, but because there's not enough money for down payment assistance in his estimation. Obviously, down payment assistance is a benefit for a much different class stratum, one more likely to make for regular voters and donors, though there's little reason to believe it's a total solution to the sweeping affordability crisis that is the United States housing system. Still, taking on housing costs is one of the most effective ways to combat inflation, which centrist Democrats claim to care so greatly about. Housing costs remain one of the most inflated aspects of American life, eating up a unique percentage of paychecks. Bringing down housing costs would be the most meaningful method of limiting living expenses for Americans, combating the inflation tax that Senator Manchin opined about so nonsensically in the Wall Street Journal. If he was serious about that worry, he would be the housing proposal's biggest advocate. So that's a survey of the likely benefits from this, if it gets passed, and also the problems in actually getting the bill passed. Over the next, 11 days, there are going to be many fights over this. I don't know when Nancy Pelosi is going to put the reconciliation bill on the floor, but she has to give the Senate time to pass the reconciliation bill, because if she doesn't, and she follows through on her word on September 27th and puts the infrastructure bill on the floor, that will give away the leverage which the progressives have. They will be forced to tank both of the bills at that particular time, or at least tank the infrastructure bill while continuing to fight for the reconciliation bill if the fight is continuing to go on. Now, a possible scenario when this gets to the situation is, let's say that the House finishes with this bill in 5 days by September 21st and puts a largely intact bill in the hands of the Senate. The House has vowed that it will not vote for the infrastructure bill until the reconciliation bill is passed in the Senate. You have 6 days in the Senate then for Manchin and his cohorts to fool around and hem and haw and object to the House bill. Meanwhile, Pelosi gave her word to Gottheimer that she's going to have a vote on that bill on September 27th. The situation will force the progressives then to defeat that bill on the 27th. Basically to say to the Senate, this bill does not pass until the reconciliation bill passes the Senate. We're not accepting anybody's word on this. You have to pass that bill in the Senate before we pass this one in the House. If you want to do this before September 30th and the end of the fiscal year, you had better pass it now. You had better pass it now. And they're going to have to mobilize a sufficient number of votes to do that. Now, a number of publications, The Intercept, The American Prospect, and the Daily Poster, have come together to do a count of how many people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus are committing to actually vote against the infrastructure bill if the reconciliation bill has not passed. Yesterday was the first day of their keeping a running tally on that. If I recall correctly, they had 16 progressives who absolutely committed to holding the bill up. Now, the infrastructure bill, unfortunately, is a bipartisan bill. It is just possible that you could get 16 Republicans replacing the 16 Democrats who won't vote for it in order to get it passed in the House. But I do think when I actually look at the people, when I look at the 16 people, I think there are probably many more from the CPC who in fact intend, when it comes down to it, to hold up the infrastructure bill until the reconciliation bill is passed in the Senate. So we have to see what happens. We have to see how many of those are really committed to a strong reconciliation bill. How many are going to waffle on some of the provisions? We don't know what's going to happen. But Stephanie pointed out in her piece that on the terms of the reconciliation framework passed by both the House and the Senate, they don't have to pay for all of it in any hard way. They only have to pay in a hard way for about 1.75 trillion of it. The other 50%, they can, as she says, just allowed to dribble on the deficit over the next 10 years. I'm telling you, we need that dribbling anyway. It would be a good thing. It would not be a bad thing to have that dribbling. A good thing for the economy, for closing the gaps caused by excessive savings and by the foreign trade deficit. So I will now turn to your comments. And after all the hellos are done, boy, the whole seems like the hellos went on till 9:51 or 9:52. And Lana says she's agreed I should talk to Tom. And Liesl Girl says that was a great article. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, that was a great article. I guess you should thank Stephanie, not thank me. And Jeffrey says, some reasons they always give you somebody to blame. Yes. Lisa, Bad Cop Theater, Kabuki. Yes, Kabuki Theater indeed. Kay says, we need to stop privatizing low-income housing and assisted living nursing homes too. Sandy Degg says, I'll do it. I'll kick him in the pants. Thank you, Sandy. And Lisa Girl says, wiped out blue 2022 there in an alternate world. JFC there, tens of millions of people about to be homeless. Yeah, the eviction crisis is going on right now, and they are doing nothing about it. I don't see anything in this bill that would immediately do something about it. We're probably going to have another 10 million homeless people because they're not doing anything about it. It's not something that can be stopped just by executive branch action. There has to be a bill passed out of Congress in order to stop it in its tracks right now. And the Democrats won't be able to pass such a bill unless they include an amendment to the reconciliation bill. And I don't know if they're up for doing that right now, because the reconciliation bill stands on a knife thread. right now. I think they have to do it. They can't allow millions more homeless people here in the United States. They can't allow it. It's a failure of the Democratic Party. They've had control of the executive branch and control of the Congress. They could have passed a law. They could have gotten rid of the filibuster for that. They could have had a carve out. If they'd taken care of it months ago, we wouldn't have this crisis now. Instead, they wasted time trying to negotiate with the Republicans for bipartisan stuff. It was performance, pure performance. Case says Stark County, Ohio, Canton area have their own Facebook page for how awful those places are here. Ohio is an awful GOP state down. Jeff says Del Bene is the richest representative in Washington state. Doesn't surprise me. She must live in a very expensive district. And Elvira Mahalko says, did you see Florida's Stephanie Murphy vote no on Bernie's bill? Well, she hasn't really voted on the bill yet, has she? In other words, the reconciliation bill has not gone on the floor. She voted against it in committee, okay, at this point. But I don't think that's going to hold. And Kay says, yes, I did shake my head. And Lisa says, what TAF? We're in an unmanaged 2.0 pandemic with no end in sight and getting worse every day. Now, Vera says, don't forget, we need to pressure James E. Clyburn. We need to kick him in the pants. Lisa says, we're racing over the cliff. We are. Kay says, yes, Elvira. He screwed me an attorney here in Ohio. Elvira says, Kathleen Rice, New York. Kathleen Rice is right. And Lisa Girl says, yeah, Long Island. Lisa says, we cut emissions by 50% during the shutdown, and no one talked about an energy reset. You might be better off just all staying home and shutting it all down. 1 week, they'll all be in diapers. Great idea. General strike. Kay says, we need Nina here in Ohio. And BL says, Florida, vote out Stephanie Murphy. Stephanie Smith-Udy is here. Hi, Stephanie, how are you? She says, just watched an amazing live stream on AUKUS. What is AUKUS? Is that an Australian channel? Stephanie says, we're just trying for war with China. Shake my head. Kay says, what is that, Stephanie Smith-Udy? Stephanie says, sorry. Hey, strangers. And Carmen says, most definitely BL. That's precisely what I posted when I shared the article on Facebook. Stephanie says, Australia, the UK, and the US are creating an alliance basically against China. I don't know what they're doing formally, but we've already had an alliance against China. So what is that about? What's changed? I don't know. Kay says, yes, I heard about that. The UK and the US will start arming Australia with nuclear subs. Oh, that one. Yeah. They give more business to the defense industry. That's what that one's about. Kay says, I heard that. Stephanie says that AUKUS, otherwise known as AUKUS, is going to be the total shitstorm. Stephanie says, I'm loving the beret, Dr. Joe. So am I, Stephanie. I'm loving the red berets altogether. Kay says, probably, but what else is new? Stephanie says, I'll try to find some good links. Evelina says, wonder what Australians think about it. Many don't like their PM, Mr. Morrison. That is right. And BL says, we need progressives to run for all kinds of office. Evelina says that she hopes that Nydia in New York pushes for new public housing. I think she is. I think she will. And Stephanie Smith-Udy gives a link to Apple News report on it. Stephanie says they probably aren't happy, well, the citizens at least. Well, in the next election, they can always kick out Morrison and bring back the Labor Party. And Lana Del says, I hope they will stick to their guns. And Liesl Girl says, we have a new housing project being built by the insurance giant headquartered here. It's across the street from the jail. It will maintain the revenue through vouchers. No one wants to live there. It's right across the street from the jail. And Liesl says we need to reinstate the Office of Technology Assessment, the OTA. Yes, I recommended that in my book on who needs balanced trade, who needs a balanced budget. Kay says the subs are nuclear powered and nuclear armed. And Kay Clark Ryan says, yeah, this alliance doesn't bode well for avoiding another nuclear war. Sandy Dare says, just what we need, another Cold War. We've been having a Cold War anyway, haven't we? Evelina says, Stephanie Smith-Udy, whole slew of them. When is Morrison up for re-election, I wonder? It's got to be pretty soon. Seems like he's been in there awful. And Lana says, Lisa, sounds awful, the new apartment. What is OTA? Evelina says, and gets voted out. Steffi says, we have a new boogeyman. It's an oldie but goodie, China. And Sandy says, puts on pants-kicking boots. Stephanie Smith-Udy says, I posted a link. Yes, you did. And BL says, who do we have to go up against Marco Rubio in Florida? Alan Grayson. Alan Grayson wants to go up against Marco Rubio in Florida. But he's got to come up with a few more good ones, like his statement in 2010. Yeah, the Republican health care plan is don't get sick, but if you do, then die quickly. Yeah, Grayson had a good one there. And BL says the Trumpers are going back to the Capitol on the 18th. The 18th of what? Carmen says, I'd live across from the jail. What's the difference? We're all in prisons by neoliberalism anyway. And that's it. That's the last comment. Carmen Muniz puts in another one. Val Demings is running against Marco Stupido. They're both running against Marco Stupido. The better candidate from a progressive point of view is Alan Grayson. But Val Demings is just another establishment tool, I'm afraid. So vote for Grayson. He at least gave some promise in 2010 of maybe escaping from the shackles for a moment or two. And BL says Saturday, September 18th. Why, that's in 2 days from now. What are they going to do at the Capitol in 2 days from now? What are they going to do? And Lisa answers the question, Office of Technology Assessment, implementation due diligence. That was a very important agency, killed by Newt Gingrich. Kay Clark Ryan, thank you all for another great discussion. Love you all. We love you, Kay, too. Carmen says, yep, Val is trash, too. She is. Stephanie says, a Duck Dynasty siege, laugh out loud. And Carmen says, good night. Mushrooms tops, laugh out loud. I jest. In fact, we did eat some shiitake mushrooms for dinner this evening, as part of our dinner this evening. Okay, I think that's the last comment. So I'm going to say good night. And Dolores says, thank you for a great discussion. And thank you, Dolores, for coming and for sharing and for supporting. Remember, on Saturday, I'm talking to Cindy Jacobs from Hull, Washington, who is going to be talking to us about the latest update from Jerry Friedman, which I'm very anxious to learn about, and also what would happen to allow Hull, Washington to fund while it's waiting for waivers. That's very important because it may or may not be waiting for waivers for a long time from the federal government. And Carmen says, I'm referencing to the berets. Oh, okay. Didn't exactly see, but this beret does look like a mushroom, doesn't it? And Lisa Girl says, good night. Keep working, please. Don't worry, we're all going to keep on working. Sandy says, thank you, Joe, Bonnie, and everyone. Jeff says, thank you, Joe. Thank you for coming, Jeff. I really enjoyed our session last night, by the way. I'm looking forward to another one in the not too distant future. I'm going to platform some more people first, however. So once again, good night, and I'll see you on Saturday at 9. Stephanie says, Dr. Joe, someone told me Keynesian economics are better than MMT. What is the difference? Well, now I have to explain the difference. Keynesian economics, okay, and MMT. But Keynesian economics deals in cycles, okay, and one of its major provisions is that it's necessary for the budget, but to be balanced over a period, of time. From the standpoint, of MMT, though, it is never necessary for the budget to be balanced. Never necessary. Always depends on contextual conditions. It is possible for a monetary sovereign economy to run budget deficits literally for generations without any threat to fiscal sustainability. That is a really big difference between Keynesian economics, like Paul Krugman's economics, and MMT economics. We've had a lot of fights over the years with Paul Krugman, including yours truly involved, in those fights. I gotta say, Paul Krugman's brand of Keynesianism, they don't know which end is up. So that's the short explanation. Very short. Jeffrey Denton says, I enjoyed it as well. Thank you again. And Liesel Girl says, love that red beret, Joe. So I've really taken a shine to the red beret. Oh, and by the way, Bonnie's wearing hers tonight also, as we speak. And Stephanie says, though, thank you. Okay, good night, everyone. After we get off here, we're going to call our daughter, see how she is. Good night, folks.